Okay, so we've given it 5 minutes or so for everybody to file in. It's good to see a variety of people from a variety of different institutions and disciplines. Very excited to have people here who are maybe not a part of this field, but are interested in this topic. That's kind of part of the idea. Should introduce myself. I'm Alexander White. I work for the Rights for Time network, which Heather is going to say a few words about in a minute, just before we get underway. This is the first of a series of monthly webinars that we're going to be running with a variety of partner institutions, or in Paladia's case, someone whose work is very much at the core of what we do. We're very interested in making these webinars the best that they can be. So if you have any feedback, either about the lead into the event, how you found out about it, what we could have done to communicate with you better, or about the event itself, we solicit as much of that as you could give us. So please, if you've got any suggestions or issues that you had, please let us know. But with that done, I think I should probably hand it over to Heather.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alexander. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first Rights for Time Research Network webinar. I'm Heather Flo. I'm the PI for the Rights for Time Research Network, and I see that I'm joined by investigators from Rights for Time. And I see you, Professor Lindsay Stonebridge. Thank you for coming. We're so thrilled to be here with you all. This is our first webinar, and we're really proud to have with us today Paladia Ziss, who is our speaker. She's joining us from Frankfurt, and she's pursuing her PhD in social policy and sociology at the University of Birmingham. Hi, Paladia, how's it going?
It's great, thank you.
I've read her paper and I'm so excited to hear her talk today. But before we get underway, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Rights for Time, which is a new project that we recently launched at the University of Birmingham in the UK. We will be holding a Rights for Time webinar every month starting this September, and you can look for our lineup of speakers on the Rights for Time website and on our social media. You could follow us on Twitter and on Facebook to get all the latest information about events like this and other network activities. We'll put that information in the chat for you. The Rights for Time Research Network is an interdisciplinary, intersectoral arts and humanities-led project. We're investigating humanitarian protection initiatives in contexts that include Kenya, Rwanda, Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine. We study community-led grassroots initiatives that protect people and communities from enduring and cumulative traumas. The Rights for Time Research Network is bringing a new temporal perspective to humanitarian protection. This is because humanitarian protection, as it occurs, tends to be driven by the immediacy of crisis, but protection that responds only to the most immediate abuse or threat fails to understand the nature of injury, and this limits sustainable solutions. Rights for Time wishes to expand the use of time in humanitarian protection, and we are studying how time is attached to policy and law. Our aim is to achieve a better understanding and significant new insights regarding the temporalities of harm to protect people who are subject to trauma and inform sustainable solutions and address the Sustainable Development Goals, most notably SDG 16 and SDG 5. We are a collective of academics and NGO and CSO partners, and we all have a longstanding track record of co-developing and delivering research in the Global South. Our research is unfolding over 3 phases. We're currently in our inception phase, where we're running our case study projects in our countries of focus. Thereafter, we hope to expand our network to include additional countries and additional project partners to continue to study more humanitarian protection initiatives, and we hope to be commissioning that work next year. So please be on the lookout for our calls. As examples of these phase 1 case study projects that we're currently carrying out, one example is work that we're doing in Kenya with the Survivors of Sexual Violence Network, who are investigating a new mobile application that documents survivors' experiences following trauma and really demonstrates the cumulative harms that they endure as they try to obtain legal services and vital help in the aftermath of their experiences of sexual violence. In Jordan, our partners from Tagayir and We Love Reading, they're inspiring children to read for fun to create change makers. And this program was introduced to children in a refugee camp in Jordan, where parents and other members of the community are reading aloud to children to encourage them to go back to school and to become heroes in their own lives. We have more research that I could tell you about, but without further ado, I'm going to introduce Paladia. Paladia is pursuing her PhD in social policy and sociology at the University of Birmingham. And what her work focuses on is the politics of time and how this shapes refugee-host relations and communities in Turkey and in Germany. Before returning to academia, she worked in the development and humanitarian assistance space in Turkey, Palestine, and Germany for many years. She holds a master's in philosophy and development studies from the University of Oxford and a BSc in human sciences from University College London. The talk that she's going to be sharing with us today is from her paper, Refugee Times as Exceptional Times, Forced Displacement, and the State. So without further ado, please, let's welcome Paladia.
Hi, thank you so much, Heather and Alex, for the great introduction. And also thank you so much for allowing me to be here and for me being the first speaker. That is super exciting, and I hope, yeah, a huge responsibility. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I hope everybody can see that. Right, so as Heather says, my talk is called Refugee Times as Exceptional Times, ? And it's kind of, the background to this is that I'm doing my PhD research in Germany and Turkey on how different temporalities shape the relationships between refugees and hosts. And if people like, I can talk about this a little bit later. This is more of a conceptual paper that I will present. Yeah. So the background to this paper is the temporal turn in migration studies, which was identified by Carling and Collis in 2018. And this looks at why people move in the first place and how migrants in general experience both moving and arrival is shaped by experiences of time in the present, memories of the past, and, as they say, relations between the present or the actual and the future or potential. And this temporal turn argues that while migration is often conceived of as a spatial occurrence, as in that a person moves from place A to place B and often across borders, if they are international migrants, it is actually mostly time that distinguishes migration from pure human mobility. So a person becomes a migrant as opposed to, for example, a business traveler or a tourist once they reside in another country for at least some duration, for example, 1 year or more, but still somehow temporarily. And this was already identified in Georg Simmel's classical work on the stranger, which distinguishes the stranger from the traveler or wanderer. With the stranger being someone who, I quote, although he has not moved on, he has not quite overcome the freedom of coming and going. This kind of implies the freedom of coming and going, but this is not necessarily the case for refugees who are outside of, as everybody knows probably, who are outside of their country of origin because of involuntary reasons and are often not able to go back. Refugee status itself is a special form of migration, but it's heavily characterized and defined by time, as it is supposed to end in what is in the UN system often called a durable solution. So either return to the country of origin or resettlement to a third country or integration in wherever people are at the moment. My paper seeks to present some thoughts on the literature on the relationship between forced migration and temporality. Most literature on time and forced displacement has focused either on migrant subjectivity, so phenomenology, of temporal experiences of migrants or forcibly displaced persons, or how states control and manage the time of migrants. In this literature, body of literature, it is argued that irregular or forced migrants and refugees appear to share common temporal experiences, which are characterized by long periods of waiting and uncertainty. And these are produced by state practices such as asylum procedures, visa regulations, border control, and detention. So refugee time is often characterized as exceptional, as refugees find themselves shut out of normal temporalities of nation states. I suggest that the assumption that forcibly displaced persons are somehow locked in a specific form of temporality often ignores the relation between structural power inequalities and uncertainties that may affect refugees and non-refugees alike. Especially in context of urban protracted displacement, de facto similarities in subjectification are brushed over. For example, how forcibly displaced persons experience times of crises and change in maybe different, but also perhaps similar ways to more permanent residents or who are constructed as more permanent residents. And this experience is influenced by legal and governance frameworks that are dependent on spatial context, but also historical conjunctures. So I would like to argue that we should draw on Fabian's concept of coevalness and investigate the politics of coevalness in asking what may be empirical features of sharing spaces as well as times in simultaneous and contemporaneous ways. And I will go into this a little bit later, what this might mean. So first on literature on the phenomenology of temporal experiences of forced migrants. There are several strands of this literature and kind of a growing body of papers and literatures looks at the experiences of time of refugees as an existential condition of waiting. So according to Conlon, waiting is a distinct spatial and temporal dimension of status for migrants. So not only refugees necessarily, but also migrants on the move. Waiting might separate various stages of movement and then staying put again. And waiting is also a particular pertinent experience as border crossings, but also in the context of highly bureaucratic asylum determination procedures in Western countries. So in this context, in asylum procedures in the West, asylum seekers may wait to file an initial asylum application, then wait for various rounds of decisions, often with several rounds of appeal in the case of early rejections. The procedure has an uncertain outcome, resulting in an uncertain duration of time, which again might be waiting for a permanent residence permit, or which is actually often provided in a temporary format, or a rejection, which then might lead again to waiting for deportation that may or may not come. Some authors experience these existential temporal experiences of forcibly displaced persons as almost absent of temporality or time on hold, as existential limbo, for example, or pause time. These are quotes by Haas, 2017, or Brooks et al., 2019. So waiting is conceived as an ambiguous liminal state during which life plans are temporarily on hold. But also waiting is not equal to doing nothing. Rotter, in her study on asylum seekers in the UK, for example, she distinguishes between different forms of waiting. They might be passive, they might be effective, active, and productive. So experiences of enforced passivity may be interspersed or paralleled with potentially active daily schedules, making time useful, learning something new, or also engaging in political activism. Also, another example is by Brunn, who studied with Abkhazian IDPs in Georgia, and she describes this mixture of imposed passivity and active life engagement as agency in waiting, in which specific meaning-making strategies are influenced by gender and class expectations. The temporality of waiting characterizes a temporary period which is related to the imagination of a future endpoint, Bryant and Knight referred to in their book on anthropology of the future, might refer to this as a future orientation of anticipation in which the present is thinned. Shahram Khosravi, he points out that in Persian and Arabic languages, the concept of waiting is expressed through words that might be distinguished by the relationship to the future. So on the one hand, intizar, which connotes positive anticipation, and sabr, related to enduring and sufferance. In the context of asylum seekers waiting for a decision of their asylum application in the West, they might positively anticipate the acquisition of a legal status and regularized existence, and also the associated rights that come with that. But they also simultaneously endure the uncertainty and dread of rejection and deportation. Similarly, in studies of protracted displacement in the global South, IDPs in Georgia conceive of their state of waiting in similar terms as Burundian refugees living in camps in Tanzania, for example, as studied by Lisa Malky. In this case, a future state of improvement might be associated with a narrative of return, which might not come. And in other cases, refugees may wait for future resettlement, for example, as studied in urban Egypt by El-Shahrawi, and also in Turkey by Kirsten Biel. And in all these cases, the uncertainty of waiting is expressed in an inability to make life plans due to the lack of permanent residence and associated rights to education, work, or housing. So the literature on waiting combines this idea of an absence of temporality in the present with an orientation of the future, which is not necessarily an absence of temporality. But other studies and other authors have described the temporalities of forced migrants as characterized by rapidly changing rhythms and speeds, which in their unpredictability actually cause existential threats. So Melanie Griffith, who's also at the University of Birmingham, she has highlighted that detained asylum seekers waiting for deportation in the UK, they seem to experience this period of waiting for deportation as existentially threatening, not only because of deportation or detention as such, and all the threat and fear that comes with it, but also it is the unpredictability and uncertainty related to frequent fluctuation that causes suffering. And Griffith called these sticky times, where nothing seems to happen, and frenzy times, where changes occur rapidly and unpredictably. For example, through forced relocation to other detention centers, or actual deportation at extremely short notice. In a similar vein, Jacobson and Carlson suggest that the phenomenology of suspension and slowness as experienced by many irregular migrants must be understood in their relationship to acceleration and speed, both in relation to rapid changes in day-to-day experiences, as well as in relation to the normativity of social acceleration in capitalist systems at a larger scale, actually, which then affect expectations of the life course. The temporal experiences of forcibly displaced persons are invariably shaped by social stratifications such as gender and age, which shape these expected rhythms of life and the life course. For example, young men and women may expect and be expected to start a family, but are prevented to do so by their existential condition of stasis. This also echoes studies on more voluntary or proactive migration, such as student or labor migration, which suggests that migrations disrupts the normal life course, understood as a linear trajectory of socially defined time periods, such as childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and old age, which then are associated with particular expectations and social norms, social roles that people have to take in these particular time periods. And these social role expectations, for example, marrying and settling down, they may be delayed for young persons who live abroad for a period of time, but are expected and expect themselves to return to the country of origin. As forced displacement by definition is involuntary or reactive enrichment terms, these disruptions to the temporal and social expectations of the life course may be experienced as both more damaging because they are kind of not chosen, as well as more liberating if socially pre-configured role expectations are escaped more easily than they would have done otherwise, might be similar to other more voluntary forms of migration or proactive forms of migration. So while there is an increasing interest in the literature in irregular and forced migrants, I find this word really difficult, phenomenological experiences of time in the present, and how these relate to individual future orientations, few studies have analyzed so far how these experiences relate to collective temporalities. So of course, there's a large literature on the how history and historical memory shapes diasporic experiences of refugees. But also imaginations of collective futures are possible and necessary beyond individualized notions of waiting for something in particular. Analogous to the ambivalence of individual futures, which might be positively anticipated and also negatively dreaded, collective futures may take both dystopian and utopian forms. For example, Lisa Markey, in her study on Burundian refugee interlocutors in Canada, she suggests that they often drew on dystopian, painful images to describe collective futures, which result from experiences of large-scale violence and erosion of trust. In relation to how Palestinians in the West Bank and Lebanon view a future Palestinian state, so a collective social organization, Feldman argues that reactions to external events and hopelessness about the future in the present coincide with experimentations of alternative visions for a collective future. As Ernest Bloch reminds us, the ability to imagine different futures is the utopian function of consciousness. It is how individual humans can venture beyond their present, imagine different futures, and importantly, act upon them in ways that allow utopia to materialize. So future imaginations, as well as considerations and memories of the past, they might be central to conceptualizations of collective refugee agency in the present. But this is not so far a focus on much of the literature, and I would argue that we need to know more about these collective temporal experiences to be sure to argue that. Why do forcibly displaced persons experience time as they do? So a growing body of literature looks at how experiences of uncertainty and existential waiting are produced through state bureaucracies via regulations of legal status, border control, and law enforcement. For example, Kirsten Beal highlights how the Turkish state maintained refugees in limbo both legally and structurally. This was before the Syria crisis that she did this study. For example, by restricting access to employment and keeping people in informal employment by force. And this had the effect of keeping them manageable and docile. Also, as everybody knows, probably at the heavily fortified borders of the European Union, strict border control measures are sometimes enforced, but also sometimes they allow migrants through. And according to Ruben Anderson's study, this practice functions as a conscious method of European border guards, for example, at the Spanish enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla, to restrict migrants' ability to plan for the future with the aim of fostering an atmosphere of deterrence. And in the context of the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian West Bank and Gaza, the Israeli military's speed of action, for example, in demolishing Palestinian houses and trees, functions as what Collins has called dromocratic violence, so violence produced through speed, which prevents future planning and also renders impossible to create facts on the ground, which are the prerogative of Israeli settlements, but not available to Palestinians, kind of keeps them increasingly temporary on grounds, on land that they have been permanently resident for a very long time. I mean, ever, probably. And these politics of temporal governance of forced displacement need to be understood in relational terms. That is, they are simultaneously decelerating and accelerating, and they are ambiguous in that way. They reinforce and also redefine existing social stratifications as they do so. For example, the duration of waiting for an asylum decision and access to social rights may vary significantly for refugees from different countries of origin. For example, the type of legal status granted to Syrians in Turkey, which is called temporary protection, until recently granted privileged access to services and the labor market compared to international or conditional protection, which are statuses granted to refugees from other countries. So temporary protection is still temporary, but it has kind of a higher status than other forms of international protection. Also in Germany, Syrian nationals were granted privileged access to protection since 2015, since what was called the refugee crisis, compared to Iraqi, Afghani, or other nationals. This has changed a little bit as legal protection for Syrians has become increasingly restricted, although the situation hasn't changed much. But it was still kind of creating this hierarchy of different refugee groups. And according to Martina Tazzioli, this is part of a wider strategy of the EU to grant accelerated asylum procedures to migrants from desirable countries of origin. And the rest may receive accelerated treatment in deportation procedures, but otherwise migrants' lives are highly decelerated in predictability and planability. So waiting and uncertainty is itself a relational power practice. It operates by accelerating and pushing some people and decelerating others, and also using speed and rhythms to enforce these stratifications. So for example, in the Palestinian context again, enforced waiting at checkpoints becomes a weapon of humiliation and control, especially if it visibly distinguishes between those who wait, who are Palestinians, and those who are way through and exhibit demonstrative speed of mobility. So asylum systems, they make use of waiting as a form of relational Foucauldian biopolitical control, which through bureaucratic methods distinguishes between those who must wait and those who receive accelerated treatment or are left in peace, basically. So why do states do that? Why do they create what could be called temporal borders that exclude refugees and produce what might be particular temporal experiences? To understand this question, we should have a quick look at the temporalities of the nation state and state power in general. So nation states construct themselves as political and social communities that have an internal joint past and an eternal future. The states might thus be understood as a chronotope in Bakhtin's words, in which space and time overlap within a particular imaginary boundary that is imbued with meaning. Benedict Anderson, of course, has argued that the development of national societies as an imagined community with definable boundaries was related to shifts in an understanding of time and temporality in the 18th and 19th centuries. Drawing on Walter Benjamin, Anderson suggests that time moved from messianic understandings, which was kind of expecting for the messiahs to always be, to his coming to be imminent, to become homogenized or empty time. So time became comparable through calendars and clocks, and this was also related to emerging capitalism and industrialization. So it became possible to imagine present simultaneities of other unknown persons that share some, in this case, national characteristics. So this national identity with a shared temporality is then enacted and enforced through the nation state. Baucom argues that the time of the nation as a people with an internal past, present, and future is encompassed within a distinct now time of the state. So the state constructs itself without alternative futures outside the national framework. Refugees sit awkwardly within this conception that connects a permanent, unchanging nation to a permanent, all-encompassing regulatory framework of the state. Drawing on Arendt's notion of the right to have rights, Giorgio Agamben says that the status of refugees has always been considered a temporary condition that ought to lead either to naturalization or to repatriation. A stable statute for the human in itself is inconceivable in the law of the nation state. So the slowing down or absence of temporality imposed on many refugees or forcibly displaced persons is directly related to their outsider status that maintains their legal and proper belonging to their country of origin and does not include them into the new community. They cannot be legally and practically imagined as members of the new political community until they become citizens or return to their home and reinsert themselves into the proper chronotopic spatiotemporal community. So in addition to practicing agency in waiting, they also appear to be citizens in waiting. However, access to legal and social rights today are not only related to citizenship, but often to the acceptance of permanent residence within a given state framework. So membership in nation states is premised less on citizenship and an end to presumably temporary refugee status. Rather, it rests on what we may call an ideology of permanence. So the governance of migrants in general is heavily influenced by constructs of temporariness and permanence. For example, visas are granted temporarily, and permanent residence and temporary visas are directly related to the desirability of groups of migrants within the considerations of capitalist labor markets, as well as racialized forms of boundary making. Permanence of residence does not exclude the construction of migrants as permanently temporary. So ideas of integration underlying much migration research and policy discourses, for example, assume that migrants somehow become part of a national community in an indeterminate ideal future, perhaps with increased duration of residence, participation in education and the labor market, and so forth. Simultaneously, even once migrants have become citizens, for example, after a defined minimum period of uninterrupted time of residence, or many have been born in the place of residence, they are still often not considered legitimate parts of the body politic due to racialized understandings of membership that construct them as temporary residents. So they are again defined, as Simmel was called, as strangers, leaving migrants in a perpetual state of integrating, as Aisha Chalal has argued. In cases of protracted displacement, where refugees have no chance for permanent integration by citizenship, discourses and appearances of temporariness may be maintained despite de facto permanence of residence, such as, for example, the case in the politics of temporariness of Palestinian refugees living in Jordan, which Lukas Oesch has described. So here, various actors at different scales have an interest in maintaining refugee status as a supposedly temporary condition, even though Palestinians in Jordan are citizens, which is different from stateless Palestinians in most other places that they live in. So their temporariness is related to refugee camp infrastructures, which are maintained because of various constellations, which include Palestinian activists who maintain the claim to return to their houses in what is now the state of Israel, landlords from whom campsites had been leased by the Jordanian government, and also the Jordanian government itself, which is managing a balance between Palestinian and other Jordanian citizens or Jordanian citizens. So despite the official rhetoric to maintaining a strict temporariness of the Palestinian refugee camps, they are also de facto incorporated into municipal infrastructures and urban renewal processes, which again contributes to enhanced permanence, and lots of people are basically born there and live there permanently. This distinction between permanent and temporary is thus ambiguous and enacted through government practices at various levels, national policies and state governments, implementation of these policies through various institutions, as well as local governments of urban development and services. So while the enforcement of waiting and uncertainty can serve as a form of Foucauldian biopolitical control, the state as a bureaucratic structure consists of a multitude of embedded and contradictory practices at various levels that enforce but also destabilize ideologies of permanence. So whether conceptualized as waiting, the absence of temporality or governmental control, most studies on the temporalities of forcibly displaced persons seem to take for granted the assumption that refugees and asylum seekers experience exceptional times that are directly attributed to displacement as such. This perspective may inadvertently reinforce the notion that refugeeness is an essentialized, if temporary, identity that is the main distinguishing and most relevant factor for individual refugees. Refugees are often constructed as if their lives were not affected either by the continuous reconfiguration of social relations through differentiated embedding, for example, employment, making friends, learning a language, studying, starting a family, falling in love. And all of these are shaped by changing social, political, and economic contexts at local, regional, or global levels, either in the locality of origin or of residence. And in fact, the policies and practices that shape forced migrants' exceptional experiences of time, including border temporalities that cut through movement as well as time, are part of how power operates in what Kitsolu and Simpson have recently called chronocracy, which are the discursive and practical ways in which temporal regimes are used in order to deny co-evilness and thereby create deeply asymmetrical relationships of exclusion and domination. And as we have seen, ideologies of permanence and exclusionary structures of temporariness are part of this chronocracy, in which refugees sit awkwardly if they reside in places for an extended duration of time, but don't become part of the construction of the nation. So phenomenological studies on refugee temporalities might be seen to contribute to a denial of co-evilness in Fabian's oft-cited terms. Co-evilness describes the German notion of Gleichzeitigkeit, which builds on Ernest Bloch's formulation and combines the meanings of contemporaneity, which is living in the same world, undergoing the same social and economic processes, as well as synchronism or simultaneity, which means sharing experiences and social lives. So this co-evilness means that temporal experiences of forcibly displaced persons may differ, but also resemble those of permanent residents and citizens, however they are defined. For example, making someone wait is a core element in how neoliberal bureaucracies across the world exert power over poor and marginalized people. Experiences of physical and existential dislocation also may be shared by marginalized persons, sharing urban spaces. For example, Ramsey has studied homeless persons in Canada who had very similar experiences as refugees experiencing the same local dislocation. So understood in this way, existential uncertainty as experienced through differential weighting, and also the somewhat arbitrary distinction between permanence and temporariness are effects of chronocratic state practices. The chronocratic relationship between the governance of time and forced migration may be particularly visible in times when time is suspended or experienced as suspended, so in situations of crisis. The relationship between crisis and forced migration is of course manifold. So, for example, state crises of various forms, they cause forced migration, for example, through violent conflict or natural disasters. Also, mass migration might cause a crisis in the receiving country, as was the case in the notion of refugee crisis, if migration is politicized by certain political groups to achieve particular aims, for example, securitization and expansion of sovereign state power. Finally, as Lindley has suggested, what happens when crises hit migrants' places of residence has been rarely investigated, partially due to the refugee or migrant-centric focus, which has been so long adopted by studies on forced displacement. Anthropologists have argued that if we describe a collective experience as crisis, we become aware that normality is somehow lost, although normality nor loss is articulated precisely what that means. The experience of crisis, either of states or of forcibly displaced persons, focuses how temporality is negotiated in the relationship between them. The notion of crisis, I would argue, may be useful as a heuristic device to analyze how state practices of temporal control interact with the temporalities of socio-political situations, and these in turn shape these phenomenological lived experiences of individuals and social groups, whether they have experiences of displacement or not. specifically in defined crises, so economic crises or others, the relationship between experiences of uncertainty and enforced temporariness of refugees and forcibly displaced persons on the move might overlap, or it might also differ from experiences of uncertainty and instability of other residents that are constructed as more permanent. Bastian has highlighted that very little work had been done on how experiences of temporality, and I would also argue that the times of governance in situations of crisis may support or disrupt development of community notions and collectivities beyond the nation. For example, we know little about how temporariness affects migrants and refugees' sociality. For example, their relations with family members, with neighbors, friends, as well as their relations to the receiving society and their local community in a wider sense. Also the bureaucracy or the new state of residence. So if we understand time as uneven, unequal relationality, again, using Bastian's words, how are temporal power relations and the politics of coevenness enacted by various permanent and temporary members of a community in times of crisis? So to conclude, I hope I have shown or have argued that phenomenological studies on the temporal experiences of refugees and asylum seekers, they highlight important features of experiential particularities of displacement. Yet experiences of time need to be considered within a broader framework of the nation state that constructs refugees as eternally different outsiders. Differences in time experiences is one often overlooked element of how boundaries between refugees and citizens, migrants and non-migrants, or permanent and temporary subjects are drawn. So this may affect individual sense of belonging and reinforces power stratifications along intersecting lines of legal status with gender, age, past and present class, and other forms of socially and politically produced hierarchies. Yet we can also ask whether and how the exceptional times of forced displacement are structured by state bureaucracies, how the temporalities of government and legal frameworks shape the experiences of forced displacement, and what this may tell us about what is constructed as normal times. This may help directing a critical and fresh look to how power shapes everyday realities, not only of refugees, but also of other communities living in the local communities that refugees live in. In that, I argue there's a need to highlight the effects of the governance of time on social relationships, as well as access to rights and phenomenological experiences. And in periods of crisis where their exceptional temporality constitute ideal historical junctures to ask these questions about the relationship between time, forced displacement, practices of power, and construction of communities. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paladia. I was trying to find my virtual hand clap to thank you for that talk. That was really, really interesting. We have about 10 minutes for questions and discussion. If you would like to make a comment or ask Paladia a question, this is ongoing research, so I'm sure there's so much more that you have to share with us today, Paladia. Please go ahead and put in the chat any comments or questions that you have, or if you're feeling brave, please go ahead and raise your hand, and we can perhaps get a little bit of discussion going that way. I'll try to keep my eye on the attendees. Perhaps just to get us going, I think probably for many of us sitting here listening, many of the things that you were saying are reminiscent of the times that we find ourselves in with respect to COVID-19. You know, you and I, when we met, one of the first things we talked about is our experience of, different lockdowns and how that's, really affected the way in which we're experiencing time. And it does feel like we are living in suspended time. But I think it's more interesting than that, isn't it? It provides us with yet another lens, I think, to reflect on the temporal experiences of migrants. Would you like to reflect on that a bit, Paladia?
Yeah, sure. I think COVID has raised really interesting discussions also in the academic context about how especially on the question of movement, right? Because everybody was kind of locked down in their own homes, as well as how borders were shut, and this has kind of interrupted in some ways the journeys that migrants of all kind of different variations have been on the move or have been trying to do. But I think also it's really important to kind of see how this experience of suspension is really probably really related to how, basically other levels of social protection. So being able to, everybody kind of is in a state of uncertainty at the moment. And I think like especially in the beginning of the COVID pandemic, a lot of people have been saying that a lot of kind of, for example, friends that I've been talking to have been saying that that the experience of COVID with kind of its permanent news, for example, permanent presence, basically like permanence of presence, is really related to other crises that people who have experienced other forms of, for example, war or displacement have experienced. And this kind of suspension of time is a little bit of a shared experience, but at the same time, it's stratified, of course. So the ability to, for example, be sure that after the end of lockdowns, you still have a permanent status or you still have a place to live, of course, affects the experiences of these kind of times of suspension in different ways than if you don't have basically, if you lose, for example, if you lose your job and for that reason lose the permanence of status, for example, or if bureaucracies are going slower because they're also working from home. So I think these are but these are not necessarily only affecting people who are on the move, but also people who are in precarious lifestyles in other contexts. So I think they are really interesting kind of ways of looking at inequalities through this lens of time, basically, and how suspension and the experience of temporariness is basically connected to a sense of security of not only legal status, but also of economic status in the end and social rights.
Yeah, so in thinking about precarity, you currently are doing some research on the ground, gathering firsthand accounts and discussing your work with people on the move. Do you want to talk a little bit about the empirical work that you're doing in Turkey and elsewhere?
Yeah, so I just recently started fieldwork for my PhD a couple of weeks ago, which is in Frankfurt as well as will be in Turkey in the second stage. So I'm trying to look at how kind of experiences of living in the similar space as well as in a similar time, I suppose, affects the way that people kind of build up relationships and build kind of connections locally as well as in other places. So here in Frankfurt, I'm talking to refugees and asylum seekers of various backgrounds who have come through Turkey, and as well as the local kind of community, parts of whom also have kind of a history of migration from Turkey, because it's like the location that I'm in is strongly influenced by migrants of Turkish origin. So I'm trying to kind of see how these kind of more historical connections and local and current connections might enable building in relations, but also might make it more difficult, as well as how that basically looks like in Turkey and how these are then affected by local governance as well as kind of state governance, and how temporal borders are basically constructed in the present, imaginations of the future, as well as through memories of the past that include existing histories of migration, similar histories of migration.
So before you started on your PhD work, you were working in the humanitarian and the development sector. So when you speak with colleagues who are working in those jobs, what are some key insights that you like to get across that you think are really important in terms of improving people's experiences on the ground and livelihoods, and also in terms of policy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think what is already happening a little bit, but I'm not sure whether people are actually reflecting upon this, is this blurring of humanitarian and development fields in some ways. So especially through the recent global compacts of migration, also refugees, there is this increasing understanding that a lot of refugees who are in humanitarian situations are in the place more permanently, and therefore the responses need to be different, I suppose. But I think what you mentioned in the beginning, there's not necessarily, this is kind of like a future orientation, I suppose. So I guess what you've said in the beginning is definitely the case, that there's not necessarily this notion of looking back so much. So where does this actually come from? It's still, I think, the case, I mean, at least in my work, it was definitely still the case that there was a lot of depoliticization going on, also for pragmatic reasons for institutions to be able to work in particular places. But basically trying to improve the living situations without solving any real problems of either the local population or citizens or refugees who are living alongside them. So, I mean, for example, as I was mentioning also in the case of Turkey, when I was working in Turkey, it was actually kind of a combined development humanitarian project. And one of the main problems was basically that people cannot stay permanently and people don't have future perspectives because of the legal status that they have. But the responses were very much focusing on the symptoms basically of this. And these are political reasons for that. And I also understand them to some degree, but I guess there's not enough awareness in the development and humanitarian field for a political perspective that looks at ideas of temporariness, I guess, of how people are maintained in temporary conditions permanently, although they are permanent. Yeah.
Really important point, I think, that you're making. Wen Yu Wu has made a comment in the chat. I don't know if you want to come in, Wen Yu Wu. You're more than welcome to join the conversation. She's reflecting on how it's relevant to her research on refugee higher education, that many young people across the globe experience similar conundrums of being highly educated but unemployed in a sense, so sort of like a failed promise of the future, yet with a different intensity of the same experience. I don't know if in your work, Paladia, either in your empirical work or some of the theoretical work that you presented to us today, whether you want to elaborate on any of what she's saying here in the chat.
Yeah, thank you, Wen Yu. I think that is really interesting, and I would love to read your research on that. I guess like the issue is that what I'm trying to, I guess, also highlight is that specific temporalities of refugees and forced displaced persons are affected by state bureaucracies, but these state bureaucracies do not only affect those, but also people who are living in different situations. So they are the same state bureaucracies and they kind of create those same temporalities in some way. So I think it's an empirical question in some sense. Like it depends on the context as well, of course, like on the living situation. It's very different if refugees are living in urban situations compared to camps, I guess, suppose. That could be also debatable. I'm not sure exactly about that. But so with the question of higher education, I just feel that labor markets, capitalism, capitalist relations are super important in understanding these kind of questions. And sometimes we kind of ignore them a little bit in refugee studies and refugee politics, which are very much focused on kind of legal questions very often.
Thank you. There was a query in the chat about where to find the paper. So I'll post a link on our website to our living archives, which is where we're hosting working papers, including Paladia's paper that she presented today. So that's in the chat. We have time for one quick comment, and that's about someone's, Irina has spoken in the chat about the experiences that she's observed in Ukraine with internally displaced people, where aid has been decreasing. I don't know if you have any research that you've come across about that, Paladia, that you'd like to briefly touch on before we close.
I'm unfortunately not very familiar with the Ukraine case, but I think internally displaced people in general is also quite interesting because that by definition, people are citizens, but have kind of particular experiences of displacement that need to be understood in the state framework at the same time. So I think that's another kind of level of kind of vertical influence of how people affect time, how the state affects time basically of people.
I think that's really insightful. That does depend on, you know, the context. Thank you. So I'll go ahead and close with that. Thank you again, Paladia. We'll give you a virtual round of applause for being our first speaker. Incredibly enjoyed that. And the paper is available on our website, or will be shortly. So please check our website for a list of upcoming events that we'll have and activities that we'll be engaging in as part of the Rights for Time Network. Thanks so much, Paladia, and thank you everyone.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day. Bye.